Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 24th, 2022. Today I'm going to discuss the clash of the two worldviews that are opposite and in contradiction to each other. I admit it's probably a bit of an overstatement to describe the transatlantic view as a worldview. More accurate would be to call it a projection of the satanic delusional view of would-be masters of the universe. We see this on Ukraine, where you have the Brits led by Boris Johnson, the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, the Biden administration. They're talking about continuing the fight to the last Ukrainian. We are beating Putin. We're degrading Russia. We are united. You hear this mantra over and over. The reality is they're running out of ammunition. The Ukraine military is taking a beating. We have this now from two different sources. One is Lieutenant Colonel Versailles, who told the Royal United Services Institute that unless there's a war production upgrade, the British and the West will be running out of ammunition. This was restated in a slightly different way, but the same point, by Admiral Sertoni Radakin, who's the chief of the General Staff, or Radakin, I guess. What he said is that there must be a modern industrial base to support a war, and the Brits and the Americans do not have it. Now, while they're jumping up and down with war euphoria, the European population is in turmoil. You have strikes, you have galloping inflation, you have shortages. At the same time that Chancellor Scholz spoke before the Bundestag praising them for increasing the German defense budget by 100 billion euros, his economic ministers and energy ministers were drafting emergency legislation, and they're now just one step away from rationing of gas. Meanwhile, in the Congress, you have the addition of $30 billion to an already bloated defense budget to support the war in Ukraine. Now, interestingly, contradicting the claims of Biden, Blinken, Yellen, and others that Putin is the cause of inflation, Federal Reserve Chairman Powell admitted that inflation was here before the Ukraine war. By December 2021, he said inflation had gone up 7% from January of that year. That's a pretty big jump from 1.4% to 7%. But then what did he say? He said, he said the war was not the main inflation driver, but COVID and supply chain problems. No mention of the real cause, the breakdown of the physical investment in the physical economy, and huge flows of liquidity in the form of quantitative easing, repo lending, and so on, into the speculative economy. Now, while this is going on, we have a slightly different perspective coming out of the Southern Hemisphere, Russia and China, with the BRICS summit that's now underway. The title is Partnership for Global Development. Now, here's something Putin said, which should be very interesting to many of you who have been following this closely. What is emerging as a potential alternative to a collapsing petrodollar system? Putin said at this conference, "We are developing reliable alternative mechanisms for international settlements. We are exploring the possibility of creating an international reserve currency based on a basket of BRICS currencies." BRICS being Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. There are many countries now trying to get into the BRICS, and the BRICS Bank is one of the leading banks in making development loans, while the Western financial system is facing default from countries like Sri Lanka and Ukraine. Now, President Xi Jinping at this conference issued a call for ending the Cold War mentality and bloc confrontation. That is, you're either with us or against us. And he said instead, we should form one big family belonging to a community with a shared future for humanity. So two conflicting narratives coming out clearly in this present situation, where we see on the one side war, depression, bailing out speculators, and on the other side, the potential for a new financial system. Now, I'll take up one question since it is Friday. I got a question from Argentina about something that LaRouche said some years ago when he was asked about inflation, and he said, tax it out of existence. Now, the person wrote and asked, what does that mean? Well, first, LaRouche's first step would be go back to Glass-Steagall, which would mean no bailouts for the speculators. That is, if you separate completely the investment banks with their speculative debt overhang from the commercial banks. And the commercial banks have debts, but if you have Glass-Steagall, those debts will be manageable because there'll be money that's lent to the physical economic producers, which can produce wealth to repay it. Whereas the speculative debt, while sometimes it gives you remarkably high returns, it also can collapse overnight, as we've seen with the Bitcoin markets and stock markets many times. So what LaRouche said is, first of all, Glass-Steagall, which would mean no bailouts. But then secondly, you tax speculative profits. And one way of looking at this is what Kennedy did, what Kennedy proposed with his investment tax credit. If you get a tax credit, you'll get it if you put it into investment in physical production, whether it's new plant and equipment, bringing online new products, worker training, expanding markets, and so on. In other words, something that's related to physical goods, to production and distribution. But if you do what people did with the Trump tax cut, what corporations, I should say, did with the Trump tax cut, which is take the money they repatriated and put it into their own stocks, bidding up stocks of companies that were not making enough profit to pay the interest of the debt, that would be taxed. That would be an example of a tax on speculation. And I think that's what LaRouche meant when he said you tax inflation out of existence. That inflation is largely the result of the creation of financial or monetary aggregates to back up financial aggregates that are bid up by speculation, but are not backed up by anything physical, any goods, anything real in the economy. And so that you actually encourage people who make profits to put those profits into real physical production. So I hope that's an adequate answer for my friend from Argentina. Now, let me conclude today by paying homage to someone who understood the difference between the delusional worldview of the would-be Anglo-American empire and the real world in which nations should work together for the economic betterment of each other. It was 100 years ago today, on June 24th, 1922, that the foreign minister of Germany, Walther Rathenau, was assassinated by people who were called right-wing terrorists. Rathenau was the architect during the war of Germany's wartime economy. And just as it's necessary to ensure that you have an adequate economic base to fight a war, Rathenau organized the German economy to keep Germany in the war long after it became clear that the war should have ended. Now, after the war, Germany was punished by the Versailles Agreement. Now, keep in mind, the war was largely a result of the British geopolitical obsession with preventing a French-German-Russian alliance for economic development centered around such projects as the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The idea of British geopolitics of Sir Halford Mackinder was that you can never allow an alliance between Russia and Germany in particular, that is an integration between the European sector and the Eurasian sector, with Russia straddling both areas, both European and Eurasia. And therefore, the British had to drive a wedge between Germany and Russia. Well, that's the same issue that we're seeing today. And after World War I, the way that was enforced was by penalizing Germany with onerous reparations imposed by the Versailles Treaty, and at the same time trying to suffocate the new Soviet economy, which had come into existence with the collapse of the Tsarist regime at the end of the war. In 1922, at a conference on how to make sure the reparations are paid, there was a side trip made by German Foreign Minister Rathenau to meet with the Soviet Foreign Minister Chicherin, and they drafted something in a village called Rapallo, which became known as the Rapallo Treaty, the idea of which was that Germany would use its resources to invest in the Russian economy and benefit from the Russian market, while Russia would then pledge its would pledge its raw materials to back up the loans. In other words, to break out of the stranglehold of Versailles, they would establish commercial and trade relations that would be beneficial for each country. This infuriated the British, who were largely responsible for the terms of the Versailles Agreement. And within 2 months, or just a little more than 2 months, on June 24th, 1922, Rathenau was assassinated. And the result was the collapse of the Rapallo Agreement, which was never then fulfilled. And instead, Germany went into a hyperinflation, which paved the way for the instability, the left-right street gangs between the communists and the Nazis, funded from above, from the corporate cartels, which intended to use Germany as a battering ram against the Soviet Union, and ultimately resulted in the emergence of Hitler in 1933 with the backing of the bankers of London, Wall Street, and of Germany. Now, that's why today it's essential to look back on this and realize the difference between what Rathenau was trying to do, which you might describe as a win-win situation for Germany and Russia, breaking out from under the British geopolitical doctrine. And then look at the pathetic Chancellor Olaf Scholz standing in front of the German Bundestag today, talking about how great it is that Germany is sticking with NATO and guaranteeing the resupply of the Ukrainian army as it's being decimated by the Russians. In other words, Scholz today is standing with the Nazis in Ukraine against the Russians. And this is a degradation of Germany. And I think it's for this reason we look back to someone like Walther Rathenau, who had a vision of the future, who was an industrialist, who had an idea of how you can take the strengths of each nation, in the case of Russia, the raw materials and the science tradition, in Germany, the potential economic resources, but also the science and technology, and combine them to break out from under the top-down control of the British Empire. So that's my update for today. Please join us again on Monday. Share this video. Take your friends and get them to start watching the videos on the LaRouche Organization and the SchillerInstitute.com. And I hope some of you will take my advice from yesterday and look into the possibility of subscribing to the Executive Intelligence Review Daily Alert and the weekly online magazine. So thanks again. See you on Monday.